In this video, I'm going to go over how to do supervised classification in ENVI. Now, this is going to be a simplified tutorial. Obviously, for your own project, you may want to spend a little bit more time selecting training sites, have some field collected or ground truth data. The first step, though, to supervised classification is deciding on your classes and then selecting appropriate training areas. So I've got a good idea of my classes, and I'm going to shoot for 5 classes. One class with forested areas that's mostly old growth or significant original growth that hasn't been destroyed by ash, new growth, recently harvested, water, and areas that are bare ground or covered in ash. So for each one of these classes, I'm going to create a region of interest. So to do this, I'm going to right-click on my Landsat file or whatever satellite image or data I'm using and select New Region of Interest. And after I create my new region of interest and the ROI tool pops up, I'm going to go ahead and rename my first ROI to represent my first class. I'm going to start with forested. I'm going to choose dark green, an intuitive color for my final classification. And now I'm going to zoom in and find representative areas that represent dense or old growth forest. Again, forest that hasn't recently been harvested. And I'm just going to trace out some polygons. You want to do a variety of ones. Ideally, the more the better, up to a certain point anyway. You want to give lots of sample data. Basically, the computer is going to look at all those pixel values or spectral profiles within these areas, and then going to use that to classify the rest of the image. The computer will use all of these polygons in the classification process to compute the statistics for these areas. And then it will look for similar areas in the image that have similar statistics and group these together within the same class. Something else that's important is if I want all of these different types of forests all classified in one class, I'm going to want to get a wide variety of samples. So if your class might be a bit heterogeneous, you want to make sure you capture that variability in your sample data. So an example I often use is if you have a lot of different types of water in your image, maybe a lake and an ocean, river, marshes, and you want all of those to be in one class, you want to make sure that you capture training data in all those different sample areas. And once you feel like you've got enough training sites for one area, and for the purpose of the lab, you don't have to do too many, do at least 3. But for your own project, you might want to do more, especially depending on the variability of your sites. And then I'm going to create another region of interest for the next class. The next one I'm going to do is ash, and I'm going to quickly create a couple different samples here of areas that I know are ash. For all of these, I'm just visually identifying them. For the best results, you can use this along with field collected or ground truth data. And I'm just going to continue to do this for all of my classes until I feel like I have enough training sites and I have a separate region of interest for each of my different classes. Make sure to always save your training data. ENVI has a couple options for this, and once we're done collecting all of our data, we're going to save our ROIs that have our training data. This will allow us a couple of things. One, if you run into an issue with the classification process and the program crashes, or you run into another issue, you still have your training data and you don't have to go through the process of collecting it again. A second important thing is that maybe you run through the classification and you see one class in particular doesn't look very accurate and has a high degree of inconsistencies. Maybe you want to go back and add some training sites or edit those training sites. As long as you've saved your training data, this is easy to do. You can open it back up in the ROI tool and delete polygons, add additional polygons for each one of your classes. Now that I'm done with collecting my training data, I'm going to go ahead and save my ROIs that contain my training data. I'm going to do this in the ROI tool window by clicking File, Save As. You can either save each of the ROIs separately, or you can save all of them together. So we could save each ROI, one for regrowth, one for harvested, and so on. Or you can simply save all of them by clicking on Select All Items. And for this one now, I might just simply save as training data to let myself know that this contains the training data for the classification. Now I'm going to start the classification workflow. If it prompts you to save your ROIs and you've already done it, just select no. I'm going to select my Mount St. Helens 1984 Landsat image and the same mask that I used for the unsupervised classification. Now under classification type, I'm going to select use training data. Now if it asks you which layer, it doesn't really matter which one. You can select the masked one. It'll only now show you the unmasked areas of the image. ENVI will automatically add any ROIs that you have open or had open during your session. In this case, I want to remove my mask ROI as this is not part of my training data. I'm going to do this by clicking on the red X to delete the class. Now all the other classes I want to keep the same, but I am going to change the algorithm used. There's a couple different algorithms, and we're going to be using the spectral angle mapper. By checking the preview box, you'll get a preview of what the classification will look like. If you can see that your results aren't ideal, this might be the time to cancel your classification workflow and go back and maybe work on your training data and collect some additional training data for sites. If you, for some reason, experience issues when running the preview or ENVI crashes, don't use it. Now I'm going to go ahead and click Next and start running the supervised classification. Just like in unsupervised classification, once the classification is finished, you will see a preview of the results come up in your window. You'll also have the option to run the same cleanup to smooth or average the data and to aggregate the data. I'm going to go ahead and keep the defaults and enable smoothing and enable aggregation. When the classification is done, you will be given the option to export the results. And make sure you export your classified image as a .dat file, but don't export the classified vectors in most cases. I also recommend the additional export of the statistics, although you can always gather this information after the fact as well. And once you're finished, you should now see your classified image open in your viewer. All of your classes will have the color scheme and the labeling that you specified when you created your training site.